And I just want to say really thank you to everyone for joining the call this evening. Thank you for taking some time out of your evening to be with us. We really appreciate you. So yeah, I am really looking forward to this conversation this evening because it's with two inspiring and brilliant women who I love working with. And I'm really excited that we have Precious in the room in person, who's come this week from Zambia to the UK to do some activism with us here. The world is facing the worst global debt crisis in over 3 decades, and it's a subject that we don't often get to hear about much in the mainstream media. But the reality is that 54 countries are in a debt crisis, and that means that debt repayments are so high that resources are being diverted away from essential public services like healthcare, education, and tackling the climate crisis. And the war in Iran is making everything a whole lot worse. We've all seen the global price surges in oil, and that's had a knock-on impact in terms of the prices of food and fertilizer. And for many countries that are dependent on these imports, paying sky-high prices for these imports means less foreign currency to make debt repayments. And so for countries that are already in a debt crisis or at risk of a debt crisis, they're going to be forced to be borrowing up even more, getting into even more debt at the same time as when they're facing food and energy insecurity. And so with this global context, it feels like a really timely, it feels really timely to have this conversation and to really unpack the topic of debt justice and debt crisis and what can be done about it with our two brilliant speakers who are good friends and allies of ours in the global debt movement. So I'm going to introduce them both to you now. So first of all, we have Precious Kalombwana, who's a debt and climate activist from Zambia and the founder of the Citizens Network for Community Development. And through this work, she promotes climate education, renewable energy, and grassroots resilience. She's also advocates for climate justice, gender equality, youth empowerment, and debt cancellation, and has a passion for amplifying the voices of women and marginalized communities in climate decision making. And Precious is going to be sharing with us what it's like to live in a country that is on the front lines of both the debt and the climate crises this evening. I'm also really excited to introduce Jennifer Larbie, who's the UK influencing lead at Christian Aid, and she focuses on policy development and advocacy towards the UK government. She also co-authored the report Between Life and Debt, and I hope that you'll get a chance to have a look at that report. I'll just ask Wiz, my colleague, maybe put a link to that report on the chat so that that report goes into a lot more detail into the debt crisis. And previously, Jennifer was head of foreign, defence and international development policy at the Labour Party, where she also directed the party's international democracy building programmes and has previously held roles in Parliament and the National Education Union. So we've got about 14 minutes or so to have this conversation, and we'll aim to wrap this conversation part around 7:30, where we'll have the opportunity for you to ask any questions to either of our speakers. And we've got Wiz online who's going to, and Bella, who are going to collate the questions for us. And also can answer any questions that you might have during the call, and also can post up resources to materials and links to things that we might mention as we speak. So we're going to dive into the conversation now, and we're going to start with a personal question, really, and the same question for you both. But the question is, what has brought you to the work of debt justice, and why has this become your fight? So, Precious, can we start with you? Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Precious Kalombwana, the founder of Citizens Network for Community Development Zambia. I started my activism way back when I was in my secondary school. I lived in a place where I'm surrounded by green forests. A lot of things were happening. We had to farm a lot, good agriculture. Everything was sustainable. Everything was good at that time until after some years, we had to experience droughts. A lot of things happened. People couldn't farm anymore because of the droughts, because we had shortage of rainfall. The weather changed that time. So during my secondary school, I had to ask my teacher to say, what's happening? Why are we facing droughts? My teacher had to say, Precious, this is climate change. I told my teacher, what should we do so that we can fight climate change? My teacher said, okay, you should be planting trees and doing sort of things that can protect the earth. We had to start a small group in my village where we planted a lot of trees, different indigenous trees. After that, after my secondary school, I completed my secondary school, I had to sit down because uh, the the place was, my village was not suitable anymore for farming because of the droughts and because of deforestation. They are still deforesting the 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 area, and I had to say that let me try to move from another city to go and look for green pastures. It's when I moved from my village to Lusaka, where Kanyama is, where I'm still living now. After some months in Kanyama, I had to experience another thing that was floods, waste management, bad sanitation, and also air pollution because Kanyama is surrounded in industrial areas. I had to ask again. I came from the village because of deforestation, because things were not going right because of climate change. And here I am in the city where I'm looking for opportunities. There's droughts, there's floods, and also there's also waste management, bad sanitation. What should we do? I started asking around again, who should we work with? Until we started and formed a group called Citizens Network for Community Development Zambia, where we started doing door-to-door sensitization, making sure that people are aware of the basic climates that are happening in our area. And after that, we had to talk to the government if we can get funding so that we should continue doing tree planting, make sure that people are informed. That time, they had to say, we don't have money to give you guys. Try to apply for international funding. We did that for 2 years until one of the colleagues said, Precious, this is not working. Let's try to find out why we are not getting funding for all the projects that we are doing because our organization is a grassroots organization, it's a women-led organization. Until one of my colleagues said, Precious, there's a problem. Our country is indebted. Our government can't fight poverty. Our government can't fight climate change because it's heavily indebted. What should we do? It's how we started campaigning for debt cancellation to make sure that we enable a just transition for our community, not just my country, but the global south and other African countries that are indebted. That's why we started this campaign in our country because we are indebted.
Thank you for that, Precious. And thank you for, I don't know, just also joining up the dots between all the various issues that people are facing in your country and connecting it back to the impact that that's having on how the debt crisis is having an impact on those various issues that people are facing every day. Jennifer, can we ask the same question of you about your journey into this into the world of sort of debt campaigning?
Yeah, thank you so much, Heidi. Yeah, Precious, thank you for such a powerful just motivation for why you do what you do. For me, my motivation or what kind of brought me into the debt justice campaigning and advocacy space really were the words of Kwame Nkrumah, the first post-colonial prime minister of Ghana. Ghana's where my ancestral heritage lies. And he fought for Ghana to be the first African country to gain independence from British colonial rule. And he talked very specifically and clearly about the role of debt maintaining neo-colonialism across African economies. And I studied his kind of economic industrial policy theory in my undergraduate and in my postgraduate, and I was just really blown away by the depth of his understanding about how to develop his country post centuries of extraction and colonization. And as I say, that critical lens on the role of of debt and how it will be used to effectively keep countries colonized in this post-colonial way just really struck me. So in my previous role working for the Labour Party and now here, I've always seen debt as a key issue and debt justice as a key issue to unlock development finance and funding and resources that belong to African countries, Latin American countries, low-income Asian countries to fund their own development. So that's been my real motivation. I think debt is the key unlock, and I think debt is also about reparative justice, which is why the way Kwame Nkrumah located debt in the post-colonial struggle for African countries, African civil society, developing country civil society. I feel like I'm somehow honouring that legacy by kind of working on this, advocating on this, both here at Christian Aid, but also back when I was working in politics.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really powerful connection to the issue and a very personal one as well. Precious, we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the impacts of debt crisis. I feel like you've touched upon it already in your first response, but we just want to unpack a little bit about what it looks like, what it feels like to live in a country that's in a debt crisis. What have been some of the impacts in Zambia for ordinary people?
Thank you so much, Heidi. I would say I would start with my own personal story and try to talk about the whole community, not just my community, but the Global South countries. I remember when I was only 15 years old and my sister was 17 years old. When my father married off my sister for me to go to school, to make sure that there's food on the table, it was very devastating for me to see that this connects with poverty and debt and climate crisis in my country. I remember vividly, like seeing my sister being taken away because of dowry, to make sure that they get the dowry, the cows, and they take me to school and also to have food on the table. That I just had to realize when I became an activist that these things happen because of poverty. And I remember when I received a call from my cousin from the village to say, Precious, your father's home is no more. I could hear his tone so down. And I had to go early in the morning to the village and see. The only words I remember that moment when I saw my father to say, Precious, I have lost my home. And I have lost something precious, the ancestral land where I buried my wife because of floods. The government had to move those people from Southern Province to a safer place. Till now, they're not back to that place. Till now, my father could say something to say, Precious, you always advocate for climate change. This is climate change. I believe you now. Keep on fighting for climate change. Until I told him there are two things that are interlinked together. That's debt and climate. They work together. If the debt is cancelled, everything will be possible for us. We'll live a sustainable livelihood. These issues are really happening. We don't have access to medicine in hospitals. We don't have quality education because our countries are indebted, heavily indebted. We don't have good infrastructures because our government is paying 30% of our annual budget, they repay loans. For these are impacts that are happening and they're still happening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Precious, for sharing that very personal account of what happened in your childhood, and also, the impact on your dad and losing not just, like you said, not just the home, but the ancestral land that is where you've got loved ones buried. It's I'm really grateful for you sharing that with us this evening, but also really using that to explain to us, sitting here in the UK, what the reality is of living in a country that's on the front lines of both the debt and the climate crisis. Just sort of exploring this idea of impacts just a little bit more, Jennifer. Can you just maybe zoom out a little bit and just from a bigger picture? Do you see similar impacts across the global south of the debt crisis as being described by Precious in Zambia?
Yeah. Thank you, Precious, for sharing that. As Heidi said, just powerful personal testimony, because I think it does help ground the kind of very big, when we talk about the debt crisis, it seems very big, particularly to our audiences listening, very big, very far away. But I think to be able to understand it at a personal human level is so incredibly helpful and grounding. We know from our partners at Christian Aid that a lot of your testimony, Precious, is very much the normal, particularly for countries that are most indebted, and the most indebted countries are across the continent of Africa. And we are seeing that huge levels of debt means lives lost, communities destroyed and divided, and futures erased. And that is because many communities across the most indebted countries, particularly across the African region, cannot access basic healthcare. And the natural conclusion is that is people dying because they can't access the most basic medication. Nurses aren't being paid. Our partners tell us across Kenya and Ethiopia, nurses are often not paid for their duties. Teachers are not paid to teach in the classroom. So education is being denied from many African children because, as you say, Precious, countries have a choice between paying off debt and the huge interest of debt, or investing in their education or health systems or basic social protections that many of our audiences will take for granted. So I definitely see Precious's story replicated across the developing world. And I wanted to draw attention particularly to, because the debt crisis does impact many global south countries, but I think what is particularly interesting, scarily interesting, is the impact particularly across the African region. When you look at how big multinational companies, big multinational banks, in particular private creditors, the way in which they lend to African countries, they lend with the highest of high interest rates because of a kind of risk that they associate with lending to African countries. And I would go as far as to say that is, that's a racist lending policy, which means that African countries are paying more in interest than other developing countries who take out loans from multinational banks or from private creditors. So the real harsh reality of the debt crisis in the way that Precious is describing is felt by many African countries as a result of practices like raising interest rates on loans to African governments.
Thank you both for collectively painting that picture for us this evening to really understand what actually is, because when we say debt crisis, sometimes it can feel very remote and it can feel very financial or very technical, but actually it's about human lives and it's about people being able to live dignified and dignified lives where they can access the basics of life that we all need. So yeah, so thank you for painting that picture for us. So we're just going to move on to talk a little bit about, you know, some of the causes, like why is this the way it is? So Precious, can you share with us what you see as some of the root causes of the debt crisis in Zambia?
Thank you so much, Heidi. It's a tricky question when it comes to someone asking you the root cause of debt in one of the African countries. It's because it comes way back from the colonial rule.
Mm-hmm.
When we were colonized by Britain,
Mm-hmm.
they had to extract our natural resources from us. They had to do all sorts of things from our countries. And even if we have independence in our country, we are not independent.
Mm-hmm.
We are still colonized by these dates. Somehow, somewhere, they'll say that Zambia got its independence in 1964. We didn't get the independence. We are still colonized by the date issues.
Mm-hmm.
We are still trapped. And they're saying Zambia is already having its independence, but they are going behind the door. Let's colonize them through date issues, through date distress. So I would say it comes way back through colonialism.
Yeah, definitely. And so thank you for raising that because I think that's a really important part of the context that actually countries that gained their independence emerged into a global economy where the rules are stacked against them. So yeah, no, thank you. That's definitely an important part of the picture. Jennifer, just continuing with that question, some people on the call tonight may remember and may have even been part of the Jubilee 2000 campaign of the 1990s, early 2000s, where as part of the global movement, we managed to get $130 billion worth of debts cancelled. So some people might be thinking, oh, what happened? Like, how come we're back in that same situation here now in 2026? So can you just maybe fill us in a little bit about what's happened in that period?
Yeah, no, thank you, Heidi. It's a great question. As it was a great historic victory that civil society around the world came together to stand in solidarity with developing countries to demand that 130 billion in debt cancellation. It's just one of the biggest, victories for for civil society, but in solidarity with people on the front line of the debt crisis. So I want people to kind of hold on to that victory, hold on to that win. But I think we do have to recognize that that didn't achieve the structural changes that are required to deal with systemic and cyclical debt crises. It didn't do enough to fix the system that creates debt crises. So in particular, and this links back to Precious, your really important reflections about colonization and the system, Heidi, as you say, that is rigged against newly developed, newly independent countries. And for me, that is almost best illustrated by the fact that we still have a global financial tax system that allows big multinational companies and corporations to build our iPhones, our cars, infrastructure, jewelry, sweets, chocolate, create all of those things, sell them in the UK, sell them in the West, sell them in the US, use those resources but not pay their tax to countries where those resources are still extracted from. A global system that means that corporations can avoid and evade taxes that could be used by those countries where those resources are extracted from to invest in their own infrastructure, to invest in their own health services, in their own education services. As great as the victory was of cancelling the debt at the time, we didn't do enough to fix the system, that means that countries still don't have ownership of their own natural resources, but they're also not in receipt of taxes that they could use to invest in their own public services. So there's so much that was won at that time, but I would say so little to fix the underlying structures and financial system that means that countries continually go into debt crises, particularly when there are huge shocks in the global economy, like the financial crisis, like COVID, the Ukraine war, and Heidi, as you mentioned, the war, the illegal war on Iran just now.
Yeah, so yeah, no, thank you for that, painting that kind of the bigger picture, because actually we need to understand the debt crisis in that context, because so often people might say countries owe their debts, they should pay them. But actually we need to understand that wider context to actually see actually countries are predisposed, are structurally predisposed to high levels of debt. Because of the sort of post-colonial, neo-colonialism, whatever you want to call it, but yeah, to have this global economy that's completely stitched up in the interests of wealthy countries, corporations, and elites, and so countries are predisposed to high levels of debt. So all it takes is a shock to plunge them into a debt crisis. I just want to move on a little bit and talk about kind of the connection between debt and climate. We've talked a little bit about it already as well. But Jennifer, just wanted to ask you to maybe explain a little bit about the connection between the two crises, because you know, when the sort of Jubilee campaign was trying to get the Get Debts cancelled back in 1990s, early 2000s, you know, countries weren't facing the acute pressure they're facing now because of the climate emergency. So maybe if you just explain a little bit about the interconnection between those two crises for us.
Yeah, thank you, Heidi. And I'll probably just build on what Precious was talking about in terms of how her family have had to move from her village to the city because of the climate crisis. And Precious, your testimony just being an example of how developing countries are on the front line of the climate crisis, a climate crisis that affects all of us, but affects developing countries most acutely. And I think it's really important to remind ourselves that this is a climate crisis that was not caused by developing countries. It was caused by developed countries fueling their development through fossil fuel extraction, right? Development fueled by, opening the ground, taking out oil, extracting resources in the most extractive way. There's no other way to describe it. Creating the climate crisis that we see. It's developed countries that are responsible for the climate crisis. Yet it's developing countries that are paying with their lives and their livelihoods. And the link to debt it's really, really critical, because we see that when developing countries are facing climate crisis, they have to recover, they have to rebuild. And because these multinational corporations and big polluting energy companies like Shell, BP, Centrica, you name them, are still extracting these resources from developing countries and not paying their taxes. Again, as I was saying, these countries do not have their own resources to help them recover and rebuild from climate crisis, so they are forced to take out loans to rebuild and recover. I remember when I was working with the Labour Party and Hurricane Maria happened, and I visited different Caribbean countries who were impacted, and I was able to visit some of the senior politicians and officials. And there was a huge fundraise from the World Bank and different aid donor countries, which only raised a few million, where the devastation cost was in the billions. And I remember very specifically speaking to senior officials in Barbados, who said we are going to have no other option but to go to private creditors to take out a loan to rebuild the whole country. So climate crises happen. there's no funding from developed countries, so countries are forced to take out loans to recover from climate crises. That's how a lot of the debt has been accumulated by many developing countries. And for me, worse still, as part of the Paris climate agreements, developed countries said that they would pay 100 billion in climate finance to developing countries to rebuild, to respond to climate crisis, and that 100 billion was never delivered. And what was delivered in the form of loans and not grants to developing countries, which is only intensified that climate debt nexus relationship. So it's incredibly layered, it's incredibly complex, but those are the connections between the debt and climate crisis that I see.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that, the climate finance, like you said, that's been delivered in the form of loans rather than grants. Actually, those loans are also at the highest of interest rates. So the creditors say to the countries, the climate vulnerable countries, we're charging you the highest interest rates because you're climate vulnerable. And it's like, but the reason why I'm climate vulnerable is because of the historic responsibility of rich countries. So there's definitely, thank you for explaining that kind of connection between the two crises and how they are interlinked and how it's like a vicious cycle of harm, isn't it? Yeah. Precious, you've talked quite a fair bit about kind of the impact of the debt and climate crises on yourself, your family, and your community. I just wanted to see if there's anything else you wanted to add to that.
I would say debt has impacted in many ways. Sometimes you may feel like to say that let me stop doing this or let me stop advocating for this cause because I'm not going anywhere. But boom, something comes out. Like you hear someone comes to you to say, Precious, I've really heard what has happened to the Central Province on how children died of malnutrition. You'd say, what? Because they didn't have food. One of the children died of malnutrition. And you say, I'm not giving up. I'm still going on. And the other thing that I would say, it's when we had to mobilize the community in Kanyama to take a letter to the World Bank. I remember vividly in 2024 when we had to strike to have a march past on climate finance building, a finance building in Lusaka. We had some chants and also did speeches on that day until we had to decide for people to go and deliver a letter, and I was part of the people who would deliver a letter to the World Bank. That moment, we just went straight. We know that this letter is going to be delivered at World Bank. And we delivered a letter just coming out from the office of the World Bank. We just saw a Land Cruiser coming on our way to say, you notorious youths, what are you doing on this private building? Get in. I was like very traumatizing, seated in that Grand Cruiser, and they were all men, and we are three females and one male. Until we went to Central Police Station, they had to ask sort of questions. We didn't have a lawyer. We just kept quiet and looking at them. They grabbed our phones for 5 hours until one officer said, "Oh, Precious, we know you from planting trees in the community. Why are you on that building? What are you doing there? That's a big institution. You should continue planting trees." Until I was just nodding my head. Until one officer said, "Okay, let me see the letter you went to deliver to World Bank." He looked at that letter and said, "This is pretty good. We didn't know that you're demanding for debt cancellation so that we can get paid or have a sustainable livelihood." Until he told us, "Go, we'll come for you when the time comes. Until that day and night, I was just thinking, because I'm a mother of two, I was thinking, if I got arrested, who's going to take care of my children?
Yeah.
It was very devastating, very painful, until I said to myself, I'm no longer doing activism like that. I'll do it in a safer way. For 2 months, I was just at home doing my own things until one day a woman came to say, Precious, your friend's son died because of the floods that the rain you saw yesterday, it killed someone. What? And I was like, let's not stop advocating for climate change. Let's do something. Until that was the thing that brought me again to activism, to fight for climate justice, to demand for debt cancellation. These impacts I've felt them, I've seen them. And one of the person had to ask me, Precious, why are you demanding for debt cancellation? It's going to be, this issue is going to be cancelled now. What are you going to do? Until we said, oh, we have our own solutions. We are doing as women. We are doing sustainable agriculture, small gardening to generate income, but we won't stop to demand for debt cancellation until our voices are heard.
Wow, that's powerful and precious, and yeah, all power to you, really. And thank you for sharing that journey. And like you said, the risks that you've undertaken to do the activism in Zambia. That's a really amazing account. No, thank you so much for sharing that. I did want to ask about your activism and just telling us a little bit more about that, but that's a really great story that you've shared with us. And yeah, your resolve to keep going, knowing that actually there are big things at stake for people that you know, for people in your country, but also globally, I guess, as well, isn't it? Um, so just following on from sort of activism that you do, Precious, what do you see as some of the solutions? What do you think are some of the solutions for Zambia? What do you think the role of the government is and of the citizens?
It's a good question, because when I was telling people that our president, Hakainde Hichilema, the president of Zambia, is very near fight for climate change. He's one of the presidents who introduced a ministry just looking at climate change and make sure that people they have access to that office. He's a champion on climate change, and he is need to fight for corruption, and also he's minister on climate and green economy and climate. They're also part of the conversation. And when you're trying to reach out to them to talk about these issues that we are facing, they are there to listen. But the issue is our country is indebted and very heavily indebted. They can't do anything. Their hands, they are tied. When you think of a person to say, no, the government is they're just doing politics. These people, they already have money. The government doesn't have money because most of the money goes for the paying loans.
Good. Extracted out of the country to pay back wealthy creditors, often in the global north. Yeah. Jennifer, I'm just thinking like tonight, people who have called in to this webinar, they've heard about the very powerful stories that Precious has shared about what the debt crisis and the climate crisis have meant for Precious herself, for her family, for her community, for her village, for her country. And people might actually be feeling quite angry and feeling, what can we do here in the UK? So it'd be good to hear from your perspective. What do you think the role does our government have any role in this? Is there any role for us as people here based in the UK? And what can we do in solidarity with the people in Zambia and for other people in other countries in the global south?
Thanks, Heidi. And I have to say, I get, even though I've been working on this issue for a long time, I get even more angry when I hear stories like stories shared by Precious today. And when we see on our news feeds here in the UK the impacts of climate change in developing countries, when we see poverty and inequality increase and not seem to go away, I think it's righteous anger. We should be angry, but we shouldn't let that anger almost disable us, because there are things that people can do here in the UK. The UK government, the City of London remains at the heart of the global financial system. And we shouldn't forget that the UK government has a huge amounts of powers that it's choosing, I now believe, willfully choosing not to use to deal with global tax evasion and to deal with the global debt crisis. Christian Aid, along with debt justice and other international organisations in the development sector, have long been calling for the UK government to introduce, to help deliver debt cancellation, and very specifically to introduce legislation that would bring private creditors to whom most of the debt from developing countries is owed to private creditors, to bring them to the table to negotiate debt relief. The UK government could introduce this legislation today, and that would bring about debt relief. And the fact that they're choosing not to do so makes me angry, and I hope will make our people listening to this podcast angry. It was the same legislation that was introduced that helped bring about the 130 billion of debt cancellation that Heidi, you referenced before. So it is something that the UK government could do today. It would be cost-free. I know that many people in the UK are worried about the cost of living. They're worried about, their own personal debts. They're worried about unemployment. But the UK government could solve the debt crisis in a way that would have no impact on anybody here in the UK. So it should make us all very angry that the UK government is choosing not to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for that. And I think both Christian Aid and Debt Justice have actions that you can take as well. So I think Wiz is going to post them on the chat for us. We've got a petition that we'd like you to sign, but also we're planning a protest there's one of the private creditors, private lenders, is actually suing the country of Ethiopia for not paying its debts, and we are going to be organising a protest around that. So if you're interested in being part of the planning for that, if you're interested in turning up for that, then Wiz is going to post on the chat some more information about how you can get involved. But there is plenty that you can do. As Jenna said, let's channel our anger into solidarity and action. So so Wiz is going to post up some Christian Aid links to some Christian Aid actions and as well as some debt justice ones as well. Jennifer, you're the influencing lead at Christian Aid, and so I guess your job is to talk to the government. So it'd be quite interesting to hear where the government is at. You said they're willfully kind of ignoring this solution that is cost-free. Do you think there's any possibility that we could shift their position? What's your take on how we're going to win change here?
Yeah, and absolutely, to your point, I want us to continue to channel our anger into action, because there's lots that we can and should do to put pressure on the government in the UK. And I do believe they respond to pressure. It's hard. Activism and advocacy is hard, but we need to continue to do it, because they respond to pressure. They respond to political pressure. And I think that pressure will continue to mount the closer we get to a general election, where the government will have to listen more carefully to civil society. So I think there's opportunities for our organisations to work more closely with domestic organisations who are making the case for the government to introduce legislation on domestic tax in the UK, but also global taxes. I think there are pressure points around public opinion. We've done a lot of polling around our debt campaign 2 years ago. We did some polling. We asked the population whether they think it's fair that developing countries like Ethiopia, like Zambia, should be spending more on debt repayments than they do on health and education. And we were really encouraged that over 60% said it is unjust, it is unfair. So I believe that public opinion is on our side on this issue, but we need to mobilise that to put pressure on the government. And the final thing I would say is ultimately the government, the Labour government, the government that is in power now, did say in their manifesto that they would do what they could to deal with the debt crisis. That is a promise that they made to the electorate. And I believe it's our responsibility as civil society to not let them get away with another broken promise. And we need to hold them to account on the promise they made to the British people in their manifesto to do something to deal with the debt crisis. And we've given them the solutions. They know the problem. We've given them the solutions. Now it's about forcing them to act.
That's right. And also, who knows, we might have a new Prime Minister in a few months' time. So and there might be a whole change of leadership. But let's see. But yeah, so thank you for giving us that sense of where the political winds might be for us to kind of make a difference on this issue. And then Precious, this is really our final question for this conversation, but we just wanted to give you the last word really. And did you have a kind of maybe what's your challenge or what's your message to us here in the UK, to the people who are calling into this meeting? What would be your kind of, your message to us?
My message is very clear and transparent. Let's work together. Zambia may be very far, but UK and Zambia, they're like this. Let's fight together, not just maybe Zambia. You may say that not Zambia is just borrowing, but Zambia wants to rebuild its economy to make sure that we have a just transition. You don't need to be very educated like me to fight for climate justice. I don't need to be a scientist. And I don't need to be an economist to know that debt and climate, they're interlinked. These are issues that came out because we are impacted. We had to know why are we facing these issues? It's because of debt. Support our actions. Like Heidi said, talk to your MP, push your MP to talk on debt cancellation so that the bill can pass, and to make sure that the private lenders should not sue countries like Zambia that are already facing the crisis. Like 2 weeks ago when I heard the news that Ethiopia and Sudan, they have been sued here in London using the English law. Supports our action, and also we are not just advocating as women at the grassroots level, we're also implementing solutions like doing sustainable agriculture, make sure that my people have access to clean water. We are also doing a sort of projects in my country, and support us.
Thank you so much, Precious, and thank you, Jennifer. That's fantastic. So I'm going to open up the floor really for some questions. If you have any questions for Jennifer or Precious, then we'd love to hear it. I think we're hoping that you've had some questions on the chat so far, but I'm just going to hand over to Bella, who is going to let us know, what's people been saying on the chat, because we can't actually see it from our end. So yeah, Bella, we'll just see what's coming up.
Yeah, Thank you so much. It's been really, really engaging conversation so far, and the questions on the chat have been great as well. So um, these are three relatively technical questions. The first being a few questions around who the debt is owed to, and in particular, how the interest rates around that is decided, and why countries are taking up loans with the high interest rates from private lenders if they can get loans with lower interest rates through the IMF, World Bank, etc. Second question, are there any conditions attached to these loans today, as historically there have been? And how does this relate to potential corruption around how the money is spent or not spent? And third is a question around the recognition of the World Bank that Zambia is a highly indebted, poor country, and they've put in a process to help Zambia cope with its debt. Someone's asking how effective that World Bank program is and what the impact it's having. Realize those are three quite long questions.
Okay, thank you. So, Jennifer, do you want us to start? Do you want me to sort of give a recap of the questions? So feel free to answer whichever one you feel able to. But there's a question about who the debt is owed to and how interest rates are decided. Why are countries taking up loans with high interest rates with private creditors when they can get a lower interest rate with IMF and World Bank? Do loans today still have conditions? So I'm thinking they're referring back to structural adjustment policies. And then a question about corruption and how the money is spent, and then how effective was the Zambia's highly indebted poor country, the highly indebted program in Zambia. So feel free to kind of address whichever one you're able to.
Yeah, great, thank you. They're all really great and important technical questions. Firstly, on who the debt is owed to, really, really good question. It's one of the things that civil society have been calling for more transparency around. So we know that many developing countries take out loans from private creditors on global bond markets, but there isn't a lot of transparency around individual kind of banks or names of kind of private creditors, because it's a very kind of convoluted and complex picture. But we, and I don't want to kind of unjustly kind of name particular banks, but we know, for example, and Precious this week did a campaign action outside of BlackRock. We know that that is a huge, it is a lender to a private lender. We know that they hold lots of different bonds. And bonds are, aspects of debt and loans that are taken out by developing countries. We know that Barclays Bank, a UK bank, is a major bondholder as well. There's a list of banks actually that we put up in our Between Life and Debt report, for which a lot of the developing countries' debt is owed to banks and private creditors. But part of the campaign actually that we have, the Restore campaign, which we mentioned, the Christian Aid campaign, is also calling for legislation that brings about more transparency for the debt that is taken out from developing countries and who it's owed to. So if we're able to get that legislation alongside, it will come a lot more transparency and a lot more openness about where the debt actually sits. To the second question about interest rates, it is the case that on average, the World Bank and IMF interest rates are lower than private creditors, but it still is absolutely the case that taking out loans from the World Bank and IMF comes with certain conditions. They no longer call them the kind of structural adjustment programs in the way that they did before, the post-colonial debts that were taken out before, but conditions do still apply, including austerity. Countries that call upon the IMF and the World Bank to take out loans often have to engage in austerity. That's cuts to public services like health and education. They're still called to liberalise their economies, that is, make it more attractive for private investors to come into their countries. And attractive means, cuts to labour rights. It means cuts to food standards in those countries. So conditions still do apply to IMF and World Bank loans. And by the way, these loans, they're not the interest rates on loans from the World Bank and the IMF. They may be smaller, but they're still far above the loans that the World Bank and IMF will give to, say, Ukraine, for example. Ukraine had to take out a huge loan from the IMF and World Bank in response to the Ukraine-Russia war, but the interest rates were a lot lower than loans that would be given to developing countries in across Africa. So there still is a massive discrepancy there. And then the final
corruption.
Corruption.
Corruption in the HIPIC program in Zambia.
So in terms of, I'm not really sure I'm getting the kind of point about, I don't want to.
I think the question was, what about corruption and how money, how is money, what the, Bella, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. I think that the question was around whether corruption emerges as a response to the conditionalities attached to these loans and the interest rates. Let me try and find the exact question. Yes, the loans come with conditions, but also bribery, so the loan is arranged outside the proper channels and someone,
Yeah, and I suppose it actually really links to the point I was making about the transparency. Transparency would work for both the lender, so the banks that lend, the private creditors that lend, but also the countries that borrow. And of course, bribery and corruption can happen when there isn't transparency. And one of the things that civil society have been calling for is a lot more transparency around the agreements and the conditions by which countries and governments take out loans from private creditors. At the moment, it could suit, countries who, may want to engage in corruption. It suits them as well as it does private lenders to not have transparency around how loans are contracted and the conditions by which those loans are contracted. So I think having more transparency, which is part of what the legislation that we're campaigning on, would open up and give citizens in developing countries a lot more oversight and therefore ownership, and be able to deliver a lot more accountability over their governments taking out the loans. But I wouldn't want to confuse the issue of corruption, or I wouldn't want corruption to be the kind of main focus of the source of the debt crisis. I think the debt crisis, as Precious was saying, is a historical post-colonial structural issue. And going back to the points I was making before about tax, I think it's equally, if not more corrupt, that you have big multinational companies who continue to extract resources from developing countries to make our iPhones, to make cars, to make our clothes, to make our chocolate, not paying their taxes in those developing countries. This is money that those countries could use to fund education, to fund health, to fund their own development. I would say that's an even more corrupt practice for us to speak about.
Yeah. And of course, we see corruption. Corruption is rife throughout the whole global financial
Yeah.
system, and not least in our government as
Yes,
well.
exactly.
We've seen in the
Yeah.
last few days, right?
Exactly. Corruption is not unique to developing countries.
Yeah, and then anything on Zambian's HIPIC program? I don't know if either of you know anything about that, and how effective it was.
Yeah.
Before you were born.
I was going to say, I don't feel like I could answer the effectiveness of it, because it was a while back. It was a while back now. Yeah, I don't.
No, but I think the overall the HIPIC program and the overall debt cancellation in the sort of early 2000s did lead to a big boost in development for all the countries that were involved, and so we saw sort of leaps in terms of things like maternal health and education and literacy, survival rates and so on. So overall, it did release a huge amount of resources. Of course, HIPIC itself wasn't perfect. It also had conditions as well attached to it because it's still, run by the international financial system, the international financial institutions. But there were kind of material differences made on the ground. Thank you for that first set of questions. Is there another set, Bella?
Yeah. And I guess in addition on that final question around the how effective it's been, I mean, and it didn't deal with the structural roots of the debt crisis, and that's why Zambia is in another one. So I suppose in a way, the fact that we're having this conversation and about all the things that Precious has shared, the impacts that she's seeing, shows that it wasn't that effective. So a question around what changes you're seeing, Precious, as a result of your activism in your community, and then a compliment to all of the speakers about how eloquently you've described the effect of the debt crisis and how it's arisen. But what are the steps that you would like to see happen to deal with it, and how successful? How are we going to measure that success? How likely is that? And then the final question in this round is, what actions can everyone watching this today, activists and supporters here in the UK, take in solidarity with you, Precious, and communities that are living through the impacts of the debt crisis? Particularly, is there anything around the G20 UK presidency? Did you catch those, Heidi, or should I read them again?
I've got them all. Thank you so much. That's great. Okay, Precious, so start with you. There was a question specifically for you there, which was, what changes have you seen as a result of the activism that you've done?
It's a tricky question because advocacy takes a long time for you to see changes. Since we're not just advocating for debt cancellation, we are also making sure that we have our own solution implemented. That is what we are doing. We are still advocating for debt cancellation and also looking for solution on how women and girls are being empowered in our communities. Just recently, last year, we had a big project that changed lives. Since 1964, that community didn't have water. We had to drill 3 boreholes for that community, and the community was happy because they were drinking from shallow wells. Those are solutions that we are doing on ground, but we are not letting go on the issue to demand debt cancellation. We are making sure that we are advocating and also implementing our own solution as women and girls.
Thanks for that, Precious. Do either of you want to answer the other question, which is about what steps would you like to see happen, and how would you measure success, and how likely are those steps?
We'll definitely use the opportunity, Precious, I don't know, to give another plug to Christian Aid and Debt Justice's, ongoing petitions to the UK government. I think we mentioned the Christian Aid's Restore campaign. We've got a petition. We'd really encourage the audience to sign the petition. Debt Justice have got a petition. These petition numbers go to the UK government. And as I was mentioning before in another answer, politicians do respond to pressure, and where they see people signing petitions in huge numbers, I believe that does apply pressure to the government, writing to MPs, Precious and Heidi said, to show that this is an issue that people know about, care about. That's a direct action you could take after this conversation and meeting. Precious, I don't know if...
I think you have said it all to say that the UK, the audience, people from UK, you can support actions that are done by Christian Aid or Dead Justice. When I was invited here, one of my friends asked me, Precious, where are you going? I'm going to London. Who has invited you? Christian Aid. Do you know someone from Christian Aid? Because you need to know someone to be invited. This is a real thing. Christian Aid has passed a mic to a person, an ordinary person like me, from grassroots level. They should pass the mic. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great, thank you. Yeah, and I think someone mentioned on one of the questions. They said, "What can we do, for example, for the G20 presidency?" And I just wanted to say that one of the things that we're doing, so both Debt Justice, Christian Aid, as well as CAFOD, and some of the other organisations are part of a UK coalition working on debt. And something that we'll be doing this year is to start mobilising people and getting people ready for the G20 presidency, which the UK will be taking over from the US at the end of this year. So 2027, the UK government will be leading the G20, which gives us a bit of space and leverage to be able to make our demands in that space as the G20 leaders come to the UK, and not least because the G20 set up a debt relief scheme in 2020 called the Common Framework, which has been hugely problematic and has not led to the amount of debt relief that countries need in a timely fashion. And so we also want to use this as an opportunity to really bring our demands to the table and demonstrate the kind of solidarity that people have been asking questions about. How do we bring that? How do we show solidarity to people like Precious and people in her community and in her country as well? So yes, I do encourage you to sign up to the Restore campaign. I think Wiz can put the link to join the Restore campaign, and she can also, and Wiz can also put a link up to signing up to our getting our updates and campaign actions. So I guess there are immediate actions you can take that Jennifer's mentioned, and there's also keeping in touch with us and keeping in touch with our campaigns. We'd love you to join our campaigns. And just before we came into this meeting, Jennifer had a really quick chat about how do we bring about change that we want to see, and we talked about we really need to build power and to make those and to be disruptive and to be in the faces of politicians, and so that they can't ignore us. And so we do want to encourage you as well if you are willing to kind of do more than sign a petition. We've also got a protest that you can help be a part of to really show up and to really make people take notice and make politicians take notice. So yeah, Wiz is going to put the email address to contact if you're interested in that. Bella, is there any more questions? We've got 4 more minutes. I think we can take one more round. Yeah.
I think let's do a really quick final question, end it on a positive note. How do you both stay hopeful despite all of the challenges?
That's a really good question, Bella. Thank you. Who wants to go first?
I think for me, it's because of my sons. I stay hopeful because I have children to take care of. And if the date is cancelled, my children will be able to go to good quality education. They will have medicine in hospitals. We will have good quality road network, good infrastructure. When the date is cancelled, that makes me to be hopeful and continue activism.
That's great. Thank you, Precious. Jennifer, what keeps you hopeful in these turbulent times?
To be honest, it's hard to stay hopeful, but definitely having faith that we are doing the right thing, and this is about justice, and my Christian faith um, compels me to fight for justice every day, and that is what keeps me hopeful. My faith and my sense that we can see justice in our time if we fight for it, and people like Precious, make me hopeful. It's easy to sit in London and write policy briefings and meet with MPs and go over the issues. But the work that Precious you do with your partners motivates me to keep going because you are on the front line. What you do day to day is a lot harder than what we do here in London. So you are genuinely a real motivation in the work that you do with your communities, and it's just been a real privilege to be able to speak alongside you. And Precious, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Precious. We're so grateful that you've come to the UK this week and joining us with so many different events and activities. Having you share your direct story and your activism is a real inspiration to us all. So thank you so much. Bella, I'm going to hand back the floor to you to wrap up.
Great, thanks. And Precious, I know you said that you're really glad that Krishna's passed the mic to you, but it's been completely our privilege to share the space with you and to listen to you. And I hope that everyone who is watching this is feeling as inspired, enraged, hopeful, whatever the amalgamation of emotions you're feeling is. That's great, but don't let it just end here. I think we can sit here and listen to this really great conversation and think, I can't believe that this is happening. This is such a blatant injustice. And then, we go about our lives and it can be busy and there's loads of stuff going on that's really awful. But don't let this conversation end here. You've seen me and Wiz plugging stuff throughout the chat the whole time. You can contact us. You can Google, if you lose the links, go on Christian Aid or Debt Justice website. You'll be able to find things quite easily. Yes, interested, angry, sad, hopeful, exactly. Please carry that with you, and use that to power you into doing something. We've done it before. We did come together pre my time, but to cancel the debt before, so we can do it again. And this time we're going to do it so that this crisis doesn't re-emerge. We're going to tackle it at its roots. So thanks again to our speakers for joining us. Thank you everyone for watching, and I hope that you have a really wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, Bella. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Wiz.